Nike didn't just drop a commercial on Christmas Day. They dropped a message. And most people missed what the message was because they got distracted by the obvious part. Caitlin Clark hitting ridiculous shots, famous faces popping up, the whole thing feeling bigger than a normal ad. But that's exactly where the trap is. Because Nike knows fans will talk about the cameos, the jokes, the vibe. Meanwhile, the real story is hiding in the part Nike never says out loud. The timing, the scale, and the uncomfortable comparison Nike basically forced the internet to make. Because here's the truth. Caitlin Clark didn't go viral just because the ad was good. She went viral because the ad looked like a declaration. The kind that says, "This is the one." And when a company like Nike signals that, it doesn't stay contained to marketing. It spills into the league, into athlete politics, into endorsement power, into who gets protected, who gets pushed, and who gets treated like the face, whether everyone agrees or not. So when Caitlin's From Anywhere campaign hit on Christmas, people weren't just reacting to an ad. They were reacting to a power shift. And that's where Aya Wilson's name entered the chat, not because Aya did anything wrong, but because Caitlin's rollout made people look around and ask a brutal question. Wait, is Nike building Caitlin like the future of the entire women's basketball machine? And if they are, what does that mean for everyone else? Because the moment you place Caitlin's Christmas push next to Aya Wilson's Nike campaign, the internet turns into a courtroom. Everyone becomes a brand expert. Everybody starts counting screen time, production value, celebrity cameos, slogans, and emotional storytelling. And that's when the argument splits into two loud groups. One group says Nike basically handed Caitlin the golden throne. The other group says people are disrespecting IRS campaign because IRS rollout wasn't lazy. It was stylized, musical, cultural, and intentionally built around a hook that sticks in your head. And that second group isn't wrong. But the first group isn't wrong either. Because the point isn't whether IRS ad was good or bad. The point is the public reaction revealed something Nike can't control anymore. Comparison. Once fans start comparing, the brand can release 100 statements about supporting women's basketball, and none of it matters the way a single side-by-side moment does. Because commercials don't just sell shoes, they create status. They tell viewers who the brand is willing to build worlds around. And on Christmas Day, Nike didn't just build a world. They built a spotlight so bright it made everything else look dim in comparison. Now let's talk about why that specific day matters, because this is where the story gets quietly insane. Christmas is not a random date for Nike basketball history. When Nike chooses to go big on Christmas, they're not just chasing holiday attention. They're tapping into legacy energy. The day itself carries symbolism, especially when you're dealing with basketball culture. That's why people started whispering the same thing the minute Caitlin's campaign dropped. This feels intentional. Not just we filmed an ad. More like we launched a chapter. And when fans feel that, they start reading between the lines. They start hunting for signals. They start asking, why this day, why this concept, why this level of production? Because you don't build something like From Anywhere if you're thinking short-term. That phrase isn't just a tagline. It's a challenge format. It's built to escape the commercial and spread into real life. Kids in driveways, people in gyms, TikTok clips. Can you make it from here? Becomes a repeatable ritual. That's not accidental. That's Nike doing what Nike has always done at its best, turning a player into a cultural activity. And once you understand that, you understand why the conversation got uncomfortable so fast. Because when Nike turns one athlete into an activity, it doesn't feel like equal marketing anymore. It feels like the brand is building an ecosystem around one person. And that's where the Aya Wilson problem comes from. Not a problem with IRS greatness, but a problem with perception. Aya is a champion. She's dominant. She's already built the resume. She's already proven she belongs at the top. So when the public sees Caitlin getting a campaign that looks like a world, they start asking why Aya doesn't get the same kind of world building every time. And that's how Nike accidentally sparked the debate that won't go away. Because it's not really about Caitlin versus Aya. It's about what Nike is signaling. And Nike signals with budget, with placement, with timing, with how hard they push a concept beyond the screen. So the debate turns into a bigger question. Is Nike treating women's basketball like a true multi-star league? Or are they quietly doing what they've always done, picking one centerpiece and building the era around her? And if you think that sounds dramatic, watch what happens when we zoom out to the signature shoe problem, because that's where this gets even more intense. Caitlin Clark is a signature athlete now. That's not rumor. That's real. Nike isn't playing around with her. They're creating logos, merch, the whole blueprint. But here's the catch. A signature athlete without the shoe landing exactly when the hype peaks creates a strange tension. Because a campaign like From Anywhere doesn't just create buzz. It creates demand. And demand without a product to grab onto instantly becomes a pressure cooker. Fans start asking questions. Sneaker culture starts getting impatient. People start speculating. And every day the shoe isn't visible, the conspiracy brain gets louder. Are they delaying it because something went wrong? Are they slow-rolling it to build a bigger launch? Are they using this like a test before the real release? And the more the speculation grows, the more Aya's situation gets pulled into the narrative again. Because Aya has her own signature story, her own campaign energy, her own brand identity. And now fans are watching Nike like hawks, looking for signs of who gets prioritized, who gets the biggest launch windows, and who gets treated like the main engine. That's how Nike created a spotlight war without ever saying a word. But the part that really flips this story is what happens next. Because once the public starts reading Nike's strategy, it doesn't stay online. It starts affecting how people talk about the league itself. And that's where things get messy. Because when a brand positions one player as the future, it can create resentment everywhere else. From fans, from media, even from people inside the sport who don't like feeling like they're being pushed into the background. And that's exactly why the Caitlin Clark From Anywhere campaign didn't just go viral. It created a fault line. And once a fault line appears, every little shake becomes an earthquake. But that wasn't the whole story, because when you look at Aya Wilson's campaign closely, you realize something even more interesting. Nike didn't ignore her. Nike just marketed her in a completely different language. And when I break down that difference, you'll see why this debate isn't going away anytime soon. Here's where the conversation around Nike gets misunderstood. A lot of people looked at Aya Wilson's commercial and immediately labeled it lazy or low effort. That reaction spread fast. Too fast. And it completely skipped over something important. Nike didn't ignore Aya. They boxed her in. Because her campaign wasn't random. It wasn't slapped together with zero thought. It was intentional, just intentionally limited. And that difference matters more than whether the ad was good or bad. Aya's commercial leaned into rhythm. Familiarity. Repetition. A name-based hook that loops in your head. That style works when the goal is recognition, not expansion. It reinforces who she already is rather than pushing her into a new space. And that tells us something uncomfortable. Nike isn't trying to redefine Aya Wilson. They believe her story is already written. Champion. MVP. Dominant force in the paint. That's her lane. Caitlin Clark, on the other hand, is being marketed like a blank canvas with infinite upside. That's the difference people feel but struggle to explain. One campaign reinforces legacy. The other builds mythology. And Nike has always been better at mythology. That's why the Caitlin Clark ad feels like it has layers. Cameos that aren't random. Locations that mean something. A phrase that doesn't just describe her game. It invites participation. From Anywhere isn't about Caitlin alone. It's about letting fans imagine themselves as part of her orbit. And that's the cheat code. Because once fans can participate, the athlete stops being just a player. They become a movement. Now zoom back to Aya's side of this. Her campaign doesn't invite imitation. It doesn't ask fans to recreate moments. It doesn't spread beyond the screen. It exists, and then it ends. That doesn't mean it's bad. It means Nike isn't building a second ecosystem. And once fans noticed that, the debate stopped being about creativity and started being about priority. Because Nike could have given Aya the same layered rollout. They chose not to. That choice is what exposed the real tension. Here's the thing brands never admit publicly. They don't market everyone the same because they don't expect the same return. Nike is not a charity. They are not neutral. They are predictive. They invest where they believe culture will follow. And right now, culture is obsessed with range, audacity, and moments that feel impossible. That's Caitlin's brand. Aya's dominance is undeniable, but dominance doesn't always go viral. And Nike is chasing virality that turns into longevity. That's why Caitlin's campaign feels like the beginning of a decade-long plan, not a seasonal drop. And that's where the internet reaction got heated. Because when fans feel a hierarchy forming, they push back. Aya supporters didn't just feel overlooked, they felt rewritten out of the future. And Caitlyn's supporters felt validated in a way that made everyone else uncomfortable. Suddenly, every Nike decision gets filtered through one question. Who are they really betting on? And that question doesn't go away. It compounds, especially when you factor in the signature shoe timeline. Because here's where Nike created its own problem. You don't launch a massive, era-defining campaign without a product ready, unless you're absolutely sure the demand will still be there later. Nike is betting that Caitlyn's pull won't fade. That 5-month gap between hype and shoe release? That's a gamble. A big one. Because sneaker culture is ruthless. Attention spans are short. Trends flip fast. And if the launch doesn't match the build-up, the backlash will be loud. But Nike seems comfortable with that risk. Why? Because they're not just selling a shoe. They're selling the idea that Caitlin Clark is inevitable. That's a much bigger bet than any single product drop. And when a brand makes a bet like that, it reshapes how everyone else in the ecosystem is treated, intentionally or not. That's why Iris' situation suddenly feels different. She's still elite, still respected, still dominant, but she's no longer being framed as the future. She's being framed as the standard. And that distinction is brutal, because standards get honored, but futures get funded. And that's where this story starts moving beyond Nike and into the league itself. Because once brands pick sides, even quietly, the league feels it. Players feel it. Media feels it. Fans feel it. And that's when a marketing decision becomes a political one. But that still wasn't the biggest consequence. The biggest consequence came when other brands started watching. Because Nike doesn't move alone. When Nike shifts, the industry follows. And once other companies see how hard Nike is leaning into Caitlin Clark, they start adjusting their own strategies. Which means this wasn't just one viral commercial. It was a signal flare. And what that signal triggered behind the scenes is where things get even more uncomfortable. Because once brands start chasing the same star, the balance of power inside women's basketball changes fast. And that's what we're getting into next, the moment this became bigger than Nike. Once Nike makes a move like this, it never stays isolated. Because Nike doesn't just react to culture, it creates gravity. Other brands notice. Agents notice. Media executives notice. And once that happens, the entire ecosystem starts to tilt. Behind the scenes, endorsement conversations changed almost immediately. Not publicly, not in headlines, but in tone. Caitlin Clark stopped being discussed as a great young player and started being framed as a long-term anchor. The type of athlete brands don't just sponsor, but align with. That distinction matters. Because alignment means storytelling. Storytelling means repeated visibility. And repeated visibility turns into leverage. That's how stars separate from peers without anyone ever saying it out loud. Meanwhile, Aya Wilson's position stayed stable. Still elite. Still respected. Still a top-tier partner. But stability isn't momentum. And momentum is what brands chase when they're thinking 5, 10 years ahead. This is where the discomfort really begins. Because women's basketball has spent years fighting for the idea that greatness should be evenly celebrated, that dominance should automatically translate into visibility. But branding doesn't work that way. Branding rewards narrative, not resume. And Caitlin's narrative is easy to scale. Range. Fearlessness. Moments that feel impossible. Those clips travel. Those phrases stick. Those images convert. Nike didn't just notice that. They leaned into it. And once they did, the media followed. Coverage shifted subtly. Headlines framed moments differently. Caitlin's highlights got treated like cultural events. Not because Aya disappeared, but because Caitlin's moments fit the modern content machine perfectly. That's when fans on the outside started feeling something was off. Not because Nike disrespected Aya directly, but because the system rewards the most marketable version of greatness, not necessarily the most dominant one. And that creates friction. Because when one player starts receiving cultural framing and another receives competitive framing, the public starts reading it as hierarchy, even if the league never intended it. And once fans believe hierarchy exists, they start defending or attacking it emotionally. That's how a commercial becomes a controversy. And here's where Nike's gamble becomes clear. They are betting that Caitlin Clark can carry more than attention. They're betting she can carry expectation. That's a dangerous bet. Because once you're framed as the future, every stumble gets magnified. Every quiet night gets analyzed. Every comparison becomes louder. Nike didn't just elevate Caitlin. They put a spotlight on her that never turns off. And that pressure doesn't land on Aya the same way. Which is ironic, because Aya has already proven she can handle that weight. But Nike isn't asking who can handle it. They're asking who moves culture fastest. That's the part people don't want to say out loud. And it explains why the two campaigns feel so different. One was designed to reinforce respect. The other was designed to manufacture inevitability. And inevitability is powerful. But it also creates backlash. Because once one athlete becomes the center of the story, everyone else becomes supporting cast, whether they want that role or not. That's why this debate keeps resurfacing. Not because fans hate Caitlyn, not because fans doubt Aya, but because people can feel the shift. And once a shift is felt, it can't be unfelt. Every Nike move from here forward will be watched. Every WNBA commercial will be compared. Every brand decision will be dissected. Nike didn't just release an ad. They reset expectations. And the final question isn't whether this was fair. The question is whether it works. Because if Caitlyn's signature shoe launches and explodes, Nike looks like a genius. If it doesn't, then this entire hierarchy gets questioned publicly. And that's the risk they accepted the moment they pressed upload. Which brings us to the final piece. Because the most important part of this story isn't Caitlyn or Aya. It's what this moment teaches fans about how women's basketball is actually valued behind closed doors. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. That's where we'll end this. Once fans started noticing the imbalance, the conversation moved past commercials and into something much bigger. Power. Because branding isn't just about selling shoes. It's about deciding who gets protected, who gets amplified, and who gets positioned as untouchable. And once Nike made its choice visible, it didn't stay inside advertising. It leaked into how moments were framed. When Caitlyn Clark had a quiet night, the conversation became about adjustments, defensive attention, and long-term growth. When Aya Wilson dominated, the framing stayed professional, respectful, but contained. It lived inside basketball. That difference matters. One narrative invites patience. The other demands perfection. And over time, fans subconsciously absorb that. You can see it in comment sections. You can hear it on sports talk shows. You can feel it in how debates unfold. Caitlyn's struggles become chapters. Aya's dominance becomes expected. And expectation is a trap. Because once dominance stops surprising people, it stops driving conversation. Nike understands this better than anyone. They know attention isn't sustained by consistency alone. It's sustained by moments that feel disruptive. Moments that force people to stop scrolling. Caitlyn's range does that. Her audacity does that. Her willingness to pull from places no one else dares to pull from does that. That doesn't make Aya less great. It makes Caitlyn easier to package. And packaging is where the hierarchy quietly forms. Behind closed doors, brand meetings don't sound like basketball debates. They sound like questions. Who drives clicks? Who trends without effort? Who turns a 15-second clip into a week-long conversation? Those answers decide budgets. Budgets decide exposure. Exposure decides perception. And perception eventually reshapes reality. This is why some players bristle when the conversation shifts away from performance. Because they know how hard it is to get noticed for dominance alone. And once someone else gets lifted by narrative momentum, the playing field changes. Not on the court, but everywhere else. And that's where frustration starts creeping in. Not because anyone hates Caitlyn Clark, but because some players feel like the system finally started working, and then immediately chose someone new to build around. That emotional undercurrent doesn't show up in interviews. It shows up in silence. It shows up in body language. It shows up in how quickly certain moments get celebrated or ignored. Nike didn't invent that tension, but they did accelerate it. Because once a brand that powerful makes a visible choice, it becomes a reference point. Every future campaign gets compared. Every absence feels louder. Every delay becomes suspicious. Especially when fans start asking uncomfortable questions. Why did this athlete get this rollout? Why did that athlete get something smaller? Why does one feel timeless while the other feels temporary? Those questions don't come from hate. They come from awareness. And awareness is dangerous for brands because it invites scrutiny. Nike is betting that scrutiny won't matter if the results are strong enough. If Caitlyn's shoe sells. If her highlights keep going viral. If her presence keeps expanding the audience. Because success quiets criticism. But here's the part nobody knows yet. This strategy doesn't just affect Caitlyn and Aya. It reshapes how every future WNBA star is evaluated. Because now there's a blueprint, not for how to be great, but for how to be chosen. And younger players are watching closely. They're noticing what gets rewarded. They're noticing what travels. They're noticing what brands lean into. And slowly, subtly, the culture begins to adapt. Shot selection changes. Play styles shift. Personal brands get built earlier. Not to win games, but to win attention. That's the ripple effect no one talks about. Because once branding becomes the gatekeeper, the game off the court starts influencing the game on it. And that's where this story is heading next. Because the consequences of this moment are still unfolding. And the next chapter isn't about Nike. It's about how the league responds. As the ripple effects spread, the league found itself in an uncomfortable position. Because once a brand like Nike defines the visual hierarchy, the WNBA can't pretend it doesn't exist. They don't control Nike's budgets. They don't approve Nike's creative. But they do inherit the consequences. And suddenly, league messaging had to walk a tightrope. On one hand, the WNBA needs Caitlin Clark's momentum. Attendance spikes. Ratings jump. New fans flood in. That growth matters, not symbolically, but financially. Expansion talks. Media rights negotiations. Sponsorship leverage. All of it benefits from buzz. On the other hand, the league has veterans who carried the product when there was no buzz. Players who endured empty arenas, minimal coverage, and constant skepticism. Those players notice when the spotlight shifts. They may not say it publicly, but internally, the math is obvious. Effort didn't change. Performance didn't dip. Only attention moved. That creates tension that can't be solved with press releases. And here's where it gets delicate. Because the league can't slow Caitlin's rise without hurting itself. But it also can't openly endorse the hierarchy Nike is signaling without alienating core voices. So what happens? Silence. Neutral statements. Carefully balanced social posts. Equal treatment language paired with unequal visibility. And fans see it. They start tracking what gets posted and what doesn't. They compare timing. They notice patterns. And when fans start crowdsourcing bias, narratives grow fast. Especially in an era where screenshots live forever. This is where media plays its role. Because once fans start arguing about marketing favoritism, commentators step in to frame the debate. Some say it's just business. Some say it's disrespect. Some say dominance should speak louder than flash. And suddenly, a commercial becomes a referendum on values. Not Caitlin's values. Not iOS values. The league's values. And that's dangerous territory. Because values aren't settled with stats. They're settled with decisions. And the league hasn't made one yet. They're letting the moment ride, hoping momentum sorts it out. But momentum doesn't resolve tension, it amplifies it. You can already see it in how fans talk about fouls, how physical play gets interpreted, how reactions get polarized. Every hard hit becomes a storyline. Every whistle gets questioned. Every non-call feels loaded. And whether fair or not, Caitlin becomes the focal point. Not because she asked to be, but because the spotlight follows investment. Nike invested big. So now every interaction around her carries weight, which puts her in a strange position. She's benefiting from visibility, but also absorbing the backlash of inequality she didn't create. That's a tough space for any athlete to live in, especially one still early in her professional career. And yet, she handles it the only way she knows how. By playing, by showing up, by letting the game speak, which only fuels the machine further. Because every time she delivers a moment, it reinforces Nike's bet. Every logo 3, every viral clip, every "how did she even see that?" pass. Those moments don't just validate her. They validate the hierarchy. And when that happens, the conversation shifts again. From "is this fair?" to "this is inevitable." That's the most powerful framing of all. Because inevitability removes debate. It turns disagreement into resignation. And that's when people stop pushing back, or start resenting quietly. Which is where the real fracture forms. Not loud, not dramatic, but simmering. Inside locker rooms, inside front offices, inside brand meetings. Everyone recalibrates. Players adjust expectations. Agents adjust pitches. Brands adjust budgets. And the ecosystem bends. Not overnight, but permanently. And this story isn't finished unfolding. Because the next phase doesn't involve commercials or campaigns. It involves moments where pressure meets reality, where expectations collide with outcomes, where the hierarchy gets tested, not by marketing, but by time. Pressure doesn't arrive loudly. It creeps in. It shows up in expectations that feel heavier than they should, in questions that sound harmless but aren't, in moments where greatness is no longer celebrated, it's demanded. That's where Caitlin Clark now lives. Because once a brand like Nike frames you as the future, every game becomes a referendum. Not just on performance, but on projection. And the margins get thinner. A great night becomes normal. A good night becomes quiet. A bad night becomes a talking point. That's the tax of being chosen. And here's the irony. Aya Wilson has lived under pressure for years. She carried a franchise. She dominated at the highest level. She absorbed expectations without narrative protection. When she struggled, it was framed as failure. When she succeeded, it was framed as consistency. That difference never disappears. It just gets louder when someone else gets a cushion. And fans notice that contrast instinctively. They start asking why one player gets context and another gets critique. Why one is allowed to grow and another is expected to already be finished. Those questions don't always come from logic. They come from emotion. And emotion drives engagement far more than reason ever will. Which is why this debate keeps resurfacing. Not because it's unresolved, but because it touches something deeper. Fairness. Recognition. Who gets grace? And who doesn't? Nike didn't create that imbalance, but their campaign sharpened it. Because now, the league has a visible center of gravity. And gravity pulls everything toward it. Media coverage bends. Defensive schemes shift. Opposing crowds react differently. Even officiating gets scrutinized through a new lens. Every whistle feels heavier. Every non-call gets replayed in slow motion. And that's when the narrative risks becoming toxic. Not for Caitlin, but around her. Because the more she's framed as the protected asset, the more people subconsciously test that protection. They push harder. They play more physical. They send messages. Not out of malice, but competition mixed with resentment. That's when moments start escalating. Not because anyone wants chaos, but because tension demands release. And the league sits right in the middle of it, unable to slow the momentum, unwilling to pick a side, hoping success smooths everything over. But success doesn't erase perception. It magnifies it. Because if Caitlin keeps delivering, the hierarchy solidifies. If she stumbles, the backlash grows. There is no neutral outcome once you're framed this way. And that's the real risk Nike accepted. They didn't just bet on Caitlin's talent. They bet on her resilience. On her ability to carry expectation without cracking. On her ability to stay grounded while the ecosystem spins around her. That's a heavy load for anyone. Especially someone still learning how to exist in this spotlight. And yet, this is only the beginning. Because the next phase isn't about branding or media. It's about moments that force people to choose sides. Moments that harden opinions. Moments that turn quiet tension into open debate. And those moments don't announce themselves. They arrive suddenly. In games that matter. In calls that decide outcomes. In reactions that go viral. That's where this story is heading. Every era has a moment when tension stops being theoretical. When it stops living in debates, timelines, and brand strategy. And starts showing up on the floor. This is where things quietly shifted from marketing conversation to basketball reality. Because as Caitlin Clark's visibility increased, so did the intensity of how teams prepared for her. Not just schematically, but emotionally. Defensive assignments became more physical. Help defenders arrived earlier. Contact lingered a little longer after whistles. Nothing illegal. Nothing obvious. Just enough to send a message. Welcome to the center. And this is where the perception problem deepened. When Caitlin absorbed contact and stayed upright, it fed the narrative of toughness. When she reacted, even briefly, it fed a different one. Every response was interpreted through the lens Nike helped create. Chosen players don't just get watched. They get judged differently. Meanwhile, Aya Wilson continued doing what she's always done, dominating inside, controlling space, imposing her will without theatrics. Her game didn't change, but the way people talked about it did. Because now, dominance was no longer the loudest thing in the room. Narrative was. And narrative has momentum. You could feel it in arenas. Crowds reacted louder to Caitlin moments. Opposing fans booed harder. Home fans flinched on every hit. It wasn't hostility. It was awareness. Everyone knew where the spotlight was. And where spotlight goes, pressure follows. That pressure doesn't just sit on the featured player. It spills outward. Teammates feel it. Opponents feel it. Officials feel it. And once officials feel it, the game tightens. Calls become conservative. Whistles come quicker. Games feel different. Not rigged. Just tense. That's when players start testing boundaries. A bump here. A reach there. A little extra on a closeout. Again, not dirty, but intentional. Because when the spotlight is this bright, everyone wants to know where the limits are. And the league doesn't always answer clearly. That ambiguity is dangerous. Because ambiguity breeds interpretation. And interpretation breeds conflict. Fans start arguing not about what happened, but about what it means. Is she protected? Is she targeted? Is she being handled differently? Every angle gets replayed. Every clip gets slowed down. Every reaction becomes evidence. And now, we're no longer talking about shoes or commercials. We're talking about power dynamics inside the game itself. That's the shift nobody acknowledges out loud. Because once marketing decisions influence how games are perceived, the sport itself becomes part of the conversation. Not just who's better, but who's favored. And that's when resentment, real or perceived, begins to harden. Not everywhere, but in pockets, in comments, in interviews, in tone. And here's the thing most people miss. This isn't Caitlyn versus Aya. This is visibility versus legacy. One represents what the game has been. The other represents what the game could become. And when those two ideas overlap without clear communication, friction is inevitable. The league hoped success would smooth that friction out. Instead, it sharpened it. Because the more Caitlyn succeeded, the more people asked why others weren't framed the same way. And the more others succeeded, the more people asked why it didn't move the needle. That's the paradox. And it's building toward something. Not a scandal, not an explosion, but a moment where everyone realizes the hierarchy isn't just perceived. It's operational. And when that moment arrives, when something happens that can't be reframed or softened, the conversation changes permanently. We're not there yet, but we're close. The moment didn't come with an announcement. No press release. No headline prepared in advance. It arrived the way real turning points always do, quietly, in real time, with everyone watching and no one fully realizing what it meant until after it was already over. A regular season game. A normal possession. Nothing that should have mattered on paper. And yet, everything did. The contact was hard. Not reckless. Not dirty. Just heavy. The kind of hit that sends a message without crossing a line. Caitlyn went down. She got back up. The crowd reacted the way crowds do now. Louder, sharper, instantly divided. But the real moment wasn't the hit. It was the pause. The whistle came late. The replay ran long. The reaction online came faster than anything on the floor. Within minutes, clips were everywhere. Slow-motion angles. Freeze frames. Circles and arrows explaining intent. People weren't arguing about the play. They were arguing about what it represented. Protection. Targeting. Favoritism. Disrespect. Every narrative people had been quietly holding suddenly had evidence to latch onto. And that's when Nike's decision stopped being abstract. Because branding doesn't exist in isolation. When a player becomes a symbol, the game treats them like one, intentionally or not. Every call feels bigger. Every no-call feels personal. Every moment carries weight it didn't before. And on the other side of that spotlight stood players who had carried this league long before the cameras arrived. Players like Aya Wilson. Players whose dominance was built through years of consistency, not viral moments. Whose value came from control, not chaos. Whose legacy didn't need explanation, but suddenly felt overshadowed. Not erased. Just quieter. That silence is where frustration lives. Not because one player is undeserving, but because the system rarely explains itself. Nike never said Caitlyn mattered more. They didn't have to. The production scale did that. The timing did that. The callbacks did that. And once fans noticed, they couldn't unsee it. Every future campaign will be compared. Every commercial weighed. Every rollout questioned. The hierarchy is visible now. And visibility changes behavior. Players adjust. Defenders push limits. Officials hesitate. The game feels tighter. Louder. More emotional. Not broken, but different. That's the real exposure here. Not a conspiracy. Not favoritism written into contracts. Just a reality of modern sports where marketing momentum and competitive balance collide. Caitlyn Clark didn't ask to become a symbol. Aya Wilson didn't deserve to feel like an afterthought. And Nike didn't accidentally create this tension. They made a bet. a massive one, the same kind of bet they made 40 years ago, hoping history would repeat itself. If it works, this era will be remembered as the moment women's basketball exploded into a new stratosphere. If it doesn't, this will be the moment people look back on and say, that's when the divide started. Either way, the conversation has changed permanently. Fans are watching closer. Players are paying attention. And brands know they can't hide behind statements anymore. Because effort is visible. Priority is visible. And once you see how power actually moves in sports, you start noticing it everywhere. If you want to stay ahead of those shifts, the ones that don't show up in box scores or press conferences, make sure you're subscribed. These stories don't end on the court. They start there. And we're just getting started.